For the next episode of Children of Heroes, we travelled about 2 hours southeast from London to the Kent Battle of Britain Museum, where we met with Mr Tom Doležal, son of Flight Lieutenant Oldřich Doležal.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your father served in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. Could you tell us more about these beginnings?
By about 1936, 1937, the Czechoslovak authorities were realising that Nazi Germany is becoming a problem, but we only have a very small air force. They didn't want to have a big campaign to recruit military because that would antagonise Germany. So they set up the Maastricht League, or the other one was 1,000 Pilots for the Nations, where they were trying to train young men to become pilots. And they would get their basic training done. The instructors were usually military pilots from the Czechoslovak Air Force. They'd get their private pilot's license, and it's a very small step from there to undergo military training to become a qualified military pilot.
Before the war, he worked for the Bata company.
His route to Bata was because he was a self-taught radio enthusiast. And at the time, Bata, they were a very progressive company, and they were developing their own air fleet to transport their goods around the world. And an extension from that was, well, if we can transport our goods around the world, we need to be able to fly our executives to meetings anywhere in the world. And my father was asked to be the radio operator on that.
His route to England was quite different from other Czechoslovak pilots, and it was again connected to the Bata company.
The 12th of March 1939, there was a business meeting required in Warsaw. Bata executives were on the plane. Jan Serhart was the pilot, and my father was the radio operator. Whilst they were in Warsaw, the Germans occupied Bohemia, Moravia. They were instructed to fly the plane to Tilbury, where Bata had another operation. On their records, they put down that Jan Serhart and my father had been transferred to work at their English depot. Mm-hmm. So they hadn't left the country, whatever, they were legitimately working now in England. And so compared to many of the other who served in the army, it was a very luxurious way to travel to the west, as opposed to smuggling over a border, smuggling yourself on coal trains in the middle of the night, risking border guards. It was very luxurious. Both joined the RAF.
What did your father do during the war?
He was now 27 when he got to England, which was, whilst he was a qualified pilot, he was too old for a fighter pilot. And so he was trained on multi-engined aircraft, which meant he joined 311 Squadron, which was a bomber squadron at the time. Unfortunately, the squadron suffered very high attrition rates, and so the squadron was transferred into RAF Coastal Command. Coastal Command was trying to protect the convoys coming over from America, but at the same time trying to sink any submarines. They could be flying 10 to 14-hour flights at any time of the day or night, and they report nothing seen. Now, it's very well known that Czechoslovaks like the sea. When you've been flying 14 hours over the sea and seen nothing, and 3 days later you're doing the same and you've got absolutely nothing, it takes a certain mentality to keep on being able to do that, because you realise if the plane had a problem, went down into the sea, your survival was non-existent. And on one particular occasion, they were following radio transmissions from a merchantman ship which was leaving Japan, and they were tracking it all the way through its route. But when the ship passed around South Africa into the South Atlantic, it ceased making radio transmissions. The RAF were anticipating, well, that ship is going to be approaching the North Atlantic, and they were sending planes out to try and find it. And on the 27th of December, 311 Squadron sent out 6 liberators to try and find this ship. In my father's case, on the radar, they picked up a ping, which is basically they found something. So they flew in that direction. There was a gap in the clouds, and they saw this ship. And as they approached it, the ship was firing back at them, so it was clearly hostile. The liberators were equipped with 8 rockets. They were fired. 5 of those hit the ship. They dropped 2 bombs. The second one hit the back of the ship, and it caught fire. And within an hour, the crew were abandoning the ship. That cargo was so important to the Germans that they had actually sent out 10 destroyers to try and protect the ship. The British Navy, the American Navy, the Canadian Navy and the Royal New Zealand Navy had ships there, again, looking out for this ship. And there was a naval gun battle. 3 of those destroyers were sunk. And what the cargo was basically 344 tons of wolfram. It's an element used in making ball bearings. And if you think how many vehicles or any other form of machines need ball bearings, and they lost a year's supply. Dr. Jeho, very well respected historian in the Czech Republic, regards that as the biggest single thing in the Czechoslovak Air Force did here. And because of that, my father, as the pilot, was awarded an immediate DFC.
After the war, your father returned back to Czechoslovakia. How was it for him?
Czech Airlines was 100% reliant upon former RAF airmen. February 48, the Communist Party took over, and they perceived that those who had actually fought in the West were a potential threat to their regime, so they started to persecute. This resulted in many of those who had fought in the West to try and escape back.
Your father escaped the country together with other pilots, and you were on board of one of these planes.
Yep.
How old were you?
6 months old, like that. For the last 2 years, former RAF airmen were being arrested, they were being imprisoned, there was a court process in between, very much on fabricated charges. My father had been warned that his name was on the list. The authorities would not allow one family onto one aircraft. My father was the instigator of the escape with Ladislav Svetlik, and what was organised between them was my mother and I would be on one plane, which was Svetlik's aircraft, and my father would fly another one. Other people also wanted to escape. We ended up with 3 aircraft and 27 people. 8 of them were former airmen. Vitangata took off from Brunei and flew into the American zone in Germany. Angela told the American commander there that there's going to be 2 more planes. In my father's case at Bratislava, as they were taxiing out, what was coming through to the control tower at Bratislava is, we've lost 2 planes this morning, we can't account for them, no more planes to take off. And Sacha, who was the radio operator, was making, we got bad reception, I can't hear you. And he switched the radio off, and they just literally just took straight off. At Erding, the Americans divided those up who wanted to remain in the West, and that was 27 of them in total, and the remainder were going to go back. In the canteen, for those who were returning, you know, they'd be there with their trays to have all the various foods, and this was very much the American foods, huge great steaks, very exotic fruit, and those going back were, some of them were actually in the Communist Party, and they were saying, see, the Americans are trying to bribe us to stay here in the West. Some of the Americans serving them were actually emigres from 1920. They understood Czech. They're now in the American forces. They could understand everything that was being said. And this is all going back to American intelligence. They found it very funny that you could bribe someone for their communist principle because you got a banana or a pineapple. And that was the first triple hijack in the world. My father and mother and the other airmen who remained in the West, they were tried. And this photo is the file of all the court documents. And it's very daunting to have a document in front of you which sentenced your mother to 25 years in prison, and the other one is sentencing your father to death.
What your father did after escaping?
He wanted to carry on flying. He found then, when he got to England and was turned down by the RAF, that his only other option to remain flying was as a commercial pilot. Then the opportunity came to go to Libya. First 2 years we were in Tripoli, which is where they were working mainly for oil companies, flying supplies to the oil camps in the desert. We had beautiful beaches, lovely warm sea to swim in. You could go there, and if you saw half a dozen people in a day, that was busy.
How was your childhood in Libya and later in Malta?
In Libya, we had the benefits of an international community. The school was called the British School of the Middle East. The teachers there were English, but we had pupils. They were from all parts of Europe, also from Canada, Australia, America, mainly from parents who were working in the oil industry. But we also had from the various embassies. And this meant that we were also getting children from, should we say, Chinese and Japanese embassies, which was particularly interesting at, say, lunchtime. You were seeing all these different international food.
Did you exchange?
Oh, absolutely. But after 2 years, my father was posted to Benghazi. There they didn't have international schools. The nearest place otherwise was Malta. And that was again a totally different experience because now it was very Italian orientated, very friendly people, very passionate towards the British because of what happened to them during the war. We were learning Latin, we were learning Italian. It meant flying 4 times a year from Malta to back to Benghazi. The pilots would know me, and so you spend most of the flights actually up in the cockpit, which you can't do nowadays. That came to an end after 2 years. We returned to England. You
worked for a company that specialized in building racing engines and later in IT. How did you choose these fields?
Like many young men in their late teens, I was absolutely mad about cars. Once you get a car, you wanted to make it go faster than your friends. The opportunity came to me to work for a company that specialized in building racing engines or items for high-performance cars, and so I was in my element there. And that took me to a lot of places like Formula One teams. I then sort of moved into working for my own businesses. One was in marketing. That brought me into IT, and I set up my own consultancy. That has enabled me to develop interest in digitizing information.
After the Velvet Revolution and the rehabilitation of Czechoslovak RAF pilots, you became interested in publishing and researching their stories. You even formed an association.
The interest in the Czechoslovak airmen has always been there because I'm born into it. What became one of the big catalysts for me was when I was invited to the RAF rehabilitation ceremony, which was held in Prague in September 1991. The Czech Air Force sent 3 planes over, and I thought, this is very déjà vu. I escaped in one of 3 planes, and I was returning back in one of 3 planes. But that trip enabled me to meet up many of the veterans, and when I got back, I talked to my colleague Barry Kudlarczyk, who was very much an authority on the Czech airmen here in the old days, and we decided to amalgamate our resources. I would digitise it all. And so we formed our own association, the Free Czechoslovak Air Force Associates Limited. At that time, virtually nothing was in English. It was all in Czech. Many descendants around the world did not speak Czech. We are now the largest resource of information on the Czech airmen outside the Czech Republic in terms of data, in terms of photographs. We've done numerous projects to promote that. In 2014 in Prague, there was a memorial, the Winged Lion Memorial at Klarov Park in Prague. The 2,507 names were all done by me.
And you are now a volunteer here. Can you tell us more about this place here?
One of my pet subjects has always been the Battle of Britain, because it happened in the skies above us. And when I was growing up, I knew 3 of the Czechoslovak airmen who participated. Here, this is the largest museum anywhere in the world on the Battle of Britain. I maintain their website here. I also encourage them to have more Czech exhibits if possible. I do a lot to promote this museum in the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. We also get a lot of Czech visitors here. This morning we had the delegation from Oldřicha come here, where they brought a memorial plaque for the 4, or known as the 4 Czech cloverleaf in the Polish campaign.
We are approaching the end of our interview. Do you have anything you would like to add?
We are just custodians of a legacy of part of Czechoslovak history in World War II. And it's important that that is remembered correctly for future generations, because otherwise we start distorting history now and it just gets distorted, and the true sense of what happened during World War II, as far as those airmen is concerned, is negated.